Okay, so before we start painting this color wheel, first thing you want to do with a pencil or a pen, I would recommend using a pencil, of course, in case you make some errors, you can more easily erase them. But first and last name at the top. And then, if we look at the instructions on here, so number one, correctly label each color outside the wheel. Well, when all is said and done, this is what our color wheel is going to look like. We're going to start with yellow at the top, and we're going to mark this going clockwise. So, right above this first space, or this first slice, I'm going to write yellow. Oops, be sure you spell it correctly. And then, again, working our way to the right, we've got yellow, green next. And then green. Blue, green, if you want to tilt it to the side to right, make it a little more easier on yourself. And then blue. Blue, violet. Violet. Red, violet. Red. I'm going to tilt this again. This one's red, orange. And then we've got orange. And then last but not least, yellow, orange. Okay, so now that it's marked, and hopefully marked correctly, we're gonna start with the very, very tip-top color, our first of the three primary colors. So for this, I'm gonna need my yellow, my black, and my white. Now, you've got three brushes, so with one of those three, and I would use maybe the larger of the three, not necessarily the flat, especially if it's larger, but the larger of the three. And one kind of rule of thumb with paintbrushes, you never really want to trust the previous person that used it because you never know if that brush is going to be clean or not. So before I start anything, I'm going to rinse this out. And I'm going to get it as dry as I can. When we work with tempera paint, like with what's in these little plastic containers, tempera paint is already liquid based. So if you take a liquid based paint and you add more liquid to it, it's really going to wash it and water it down. So I'm going to crack the lid on my yellow. And since we have a fair amount of painting to do throughout this term, we've got to be really resourceful and not wasteful with what we've got. So to start, I'm going to take one little brush load. I'm going to paint that into a spot on this sheet of magazine paper. Now, I'm going to take this brush, and since I'm going to have to use it later to retrieve some white and some black, I'm going to put that in my water and I'm going to let it soak. With my smaller brush, and this one I've already cleaned, I'm going to start with painting the hue of my yellow. Now, the hue, and it may be kind of difficult to see with the reflection that's here, but the hue is going to be the solid color with nothing else added in. So it's my solid yellow, not my yellow with a little bit of white or my yellow with a little bit of black. So, taking my brush, very carefully, trying to stay inside the lines. I'm going to paint this whole thing in with my solid hue of yellow. And make it easy on yourself. You know, if it's difficult to kink your hand at a certain angle to paint, well, rotate your paper. I'm sure you're not dipping the edges or the corners of this thing into your paint. And now I can take and finish off the hue of yellow. Now, the first instinct with a lot of people is, When they finish painting a space, they want to immediately put their brush in water and rinse it out. For this, since we're gonna do our tint next, and the tint is gonna be our hue with a very, very, very kind of small or proportionate amount of white, I'm gonna leave the pigment that I have in this brush. I'm gonna set it down. I'm gonna rinse out my kind of larger mixing brush, dry this off. And now, crack the lid on my white, take a brush load, paint it right here. Now, I need this brush to retrieve my black later, so that goes back in the water. And now with this brush, the smaller, it still has a little bit of the yellow pigment in those bristles. So I'm gonna take what's in there and I'm gonna mix that straight into my white. I'm not gonna re-dip into the yellow. I'm just gonna mix what I have into the white. Now, when you go to paint your tint, especially with a color like yellow, yellow's already pretty light. When you add white to it, if you don't add enough, you really can't see a much brighter or a much lighter version of that color. So after it's painted, look and compare the tint that you've got to the hue that's still on your paint sheet. And if they still look a little similar, no big deal. Take your mixing brush, dip in, add a little more white to what you've got, and mix that together. I think mine is plenty light. So now I'm gonna take and I'm gonna paint the tinted portion. So paint the primary colors, including the tints and shades first. Yellow must be at the top. We've already got that. Hue in this center, tint in the outer, and then shade will go on the inner portion. So I've got my tint very, very carefully, just like when I painted the hue. I'm gonna go edge to edge, corner to corner, trying to stay within the lines. Now, if at any point I may be going a little too fast for some of you, well, that's the beauty of the situation that we're in. You can always pause the video, you can rewind, you can rewatch, all of that. So if I'm moving too quickly for you, not the end of the world. I will continue going on, but feel free to pause, rewind, and go back and try it again if you need to. All right, rotate my paper, make it a little bit easier on my wrist. All right, now that the tint is done, I am gonna rinse my brush out. Now, the reason I wanna rinse my brush out before I go from the tint into the shade, when I add black, if I take and begin mixing the black with this same brush, well, we know that if you add black and white together, it's gonna give you some version of gray on the spectrum. Well, that will tend to mute the color. So since we're looking for the purest form of these three values, the hue, the tint, and the shade, now I've got to be doubly sure to take, rinse my brush out, get it nice and dry, and then crack the lid on the black. Now, again, yellow already being a very, very, very light color, when you add essentially its opposite, when you add the darkest possible color, a little bit is gonna go a long way. So using my clean, dry, smaller brush, I'm gonna dip a very, very, very tiny amount. Now, I don't even know if that's visible on the camera, but it is super, super small. Now I'm gonna take what I've got into the leftover hue that's already on this paint sheet. I'm gonna mix that in, and you can see immediately it starts to darken, it starts to deepen. I'm gonna be careful not to accidentally swish this down and get it into my tint, because again, I don't want anything that looks grayed out. And don't be alarmed, when you shade these lighter colors like yellow, yellow-green, green, yellow-orange, and orange, at times the shade is gonna look a little brown or maybe even a little greenish brown. As long as you followed the steps that I've shown you, then that greenish brown kind of color is correct. Now, on our Google Classroom, I've posted a photograph that I took of a finished version of this color wheel. It's the same exact version that I have sitting here. And you can see what I mean by kind of yellowish brown or greenish brown at times. So if you followed the instructions, you rinsed the brushes, you did all of that, then just trust the mixture that you've got. Like the tint though, you want to be sure that your shade is darker than the visible hue. With yellow, that's not really that difficult of a task. Because remember, a little bit of black will go a long, long way. All right, here we are. Finished with the primary yellow. Okay, so if you make a little bit of a mistake on, you get some paint on the table, if you're working on a desk at home or if you're working on your kitchen table at home, little errors like that are incredibly easy to clean up. All we're working with is tempera paint. Tempera paint is not going to stain your clothes. Tempera paint is not going to stain your furniture, but the longer you let it sit, the harder it is to wipe clean. So I'm going to grab a paper towel, dip it in a little bit of water, wipe, dry. And now if my mom comes in, she'll never know that I made a little bit of a mess. Okay, now before I move from painting my yellow and I start my blue next, because we're gonna work clockwise around this, and so we're gonna do the 3 primary colors first, yellow, blue, red. What I wanna do, just because knowing anything about color, if you do or if you don't, well, that's why you're in this class, you're here to learn. But if I go to do my blue next and I've got yellow mixed in my water, when I go to rinse my brush, if it's got blue on it, we know that yellow and blue is gonna make, and I'm gonna leave that right there. I'm gonna let you figure that one out on your own. But before I mix and I start doing the hue, tint, and shade of my blue, I'm gonna dump, rinse, and refill my water container. Voila. So I've got my clean water, my clean brushes. I'm gonna take both of these out, get them both dried off. And I just use just a regular kind of hand towel that I have laying around at home. So now I'm gonna repeat this same exact process for my blue and my red. For the time being, I don't want you to get started on the orange, the green, or the violet, our 3 complementary colors, because that's gonna be a completely different painting lesson in itself. So I'm not gonna talk my way through this one. I'm gonna hit the time lapse on it. Just be sure, follow along, and don't forget it's the same process as all of the yellow. Hue first, tint next, shade last.